Hey folks, it is Sol with some more Shadowlands coverage. Today we're going to dip our toes into Soulbinds, which is part of what makes up Shadowlands' biggest feature, Covenants. They're not the only piece of the pie. There's the theme or aesthetics, there's the Covenant abilities, and to a lesser extent, the anima powers in Torghast that will influence them. Together with Soulbinds, we're somehow supposed to make a call on who our characters are going to represent and not feel bad about it. Soulbinds are what I would call a customizable profile that you can tailor your habits in-game to make you a more effective tank who can resist crowd control, or a more efficient world quest farming machine, or someone who lives and dies in PvP battlegrounds. There's not a ton that we know about Soulbinds, other than that we eventually are going to have 3 trees that we unlock and progress down as we do things for said Soulbind. And there are conduits that we can slot into them to increase our survivability, our throughputs, or utility. At the end of the day, we're going to customize each of these 3 trees to best fit our playstyle, and then switch between them as the need arises. So you can think of them as super talents. We're going to go through each of the Covenant Soulbinds and highlight some of the key influential nodes that we can select, thanks to some information provided by Icy Veins. However, please keep in mind that this is the alpha. We're looking at untested, data-mined information, so take that into consideration before making any judgments. A link to the post is in the description below, but let's take a look at what Soulbinds have to offer, starting with the Korayn Covenant. Forgelite Prime Mikanikos comes first, and at the top of the tree, which is what is probably immediately available upon unlocking the Soulbind, is Elite Mixture, which is a placeholder, but we also encounter Forgelite Filter. The duration of most debuffs is reduced by 50%, presumably while this shield is up. On a side note, Phial of Serenity is a potion that's provided to you by Summoned Steward, the Korayn signature ability. It has 3 charges, and it obeys the rules of other potions. In the middle of the tree, Sparkling Drift Globe Core makes you stun all nearby enemies for 3 seconds when you're reduced below 35% health, and has a 5-minute cooldown. Alternatively, you can choose Soul Steel Clamps, kind of my favorite one, where after standing still for 5 seconds, stun and incapacitate durations are reduced by 30%. At the bottom of the tree, you learn Bronze Schematics, which will give you a damage reduction buff for 10 seconds after using 20 spells or abilities. I'm not going to cover every Soulbind with the same commentary, but this particular Soulbind has a few implications, like making you sturdier in PvP and allowing you to deal with debuffs a little bit easier. Soul Steel Clamps, in my opinion, is a bit better than the Relentless PvP talent, but you do need to be standing still in order to take advantage of it. And the bottom trait is clearly the most advantageous for tanks, who have an extremely high ability per minute usage, and this trait clearly benefits tanks the most. Moving on, Clea at least has 2 nodes to choose from at the top of her tree. Ascendant Phial makes you immune to curses, disease, poisons, and bleed effects for 15 seconds. Or you can choose Phial of Patience, which increases the healing that Phial does, but it turns it into a heal over time. Ascendant Phial, it seems pretty broken in my opinion, especially if this makes you immune to debuffs from bosses. It's like having a paladin in your pocket who can cast Blessing of Protection or Blessing of Spell Warding on you. Further down the tree, we can choose between the Korayn Grace and Korayn Perseverance. Korayn Grace is support focused. It makes you slow down enemies or increasing allied movement speed with your abilities. With Korayn Perseverance, your heals leave a heal over time that lasts for 15 seconds, kind of like a free Echo of Light. Skipping down to the bottom of Clea's tree is Valiant Strikes. Crits by you or other nearby allies will build stacks of this buff, and at 40 stacks, it will detonate, healing nearby allies over 10 seconds, which based on the numbers, it isn't so great, but if you're constantly positioned near a large group, this is a lot of free healing. And as you're watching and listening to all these abilities, consider how some of these abilities will mesh together in a group setting like Mythic Plus, large raids, or PvP battlegrounds, especially if many of you are part of the same covenant. Moving on to Pelagos, he appears to only have 1 trait at the top of the tree, Let Go of the Past, which if you don't just press 1 button all the time, you pretty much have a constant versatility bonus of 5. Going further down, focusing Mantra lowers the cooldown of Vial of Serenity by 1 second when you defeat an enemy. Not really worth it for a prolonged fight, but it's great for content like Torghast, which can provide anima powers that turn Vial of Serenity into an extremely powerful buff. At the bottom of the tree is Combat Meditation, which makes your Covenant ability increase your haste by 5% for at least 20 seconds. It's not a bad bottom trait at all, but it depends on the cooldown of your class's Covenant ability and how regularly it fits in your gameplay. So at least at the moment, this is the kind of interaction that we're seeing between Soulbinds and the class Covenant abilities. Moving on to the Venthyr, we start with General Draven, and at the top of his tree is either Anima Infusion or Expedition Leader, which already kind of leaves the impression that, okay, it's not really a great impression at all. Anima Infusion reads like it's strictly a benefit from Torghast, and for outdoor content, while Expedition Leader is clearly meant for the avid world quest completionists, I mean, that's it. But I mean, who am I to judge, right? Just a little bit further down this tree is a choice between throughput and survivability. With Superior Tactics, you increase your crit by 10% for 10 seconds when you successfully interrupt or dispel a debuff. Meanwhile, Hold Your Ground gives you more stamina and healing throughput while standing still. Further down, Move as One lets you leech your friend's movement speed boosts by up to 30% increased movement speed for yourself. Not bad. And at the bottom, using your Covenant class ability gives you a large versatility bonus and a nice little bonus for nearby allies, which lasts for 15 seconds. However, consider this. Consider that the Paladin's Ashen Hollow ability has a 4-minute cooldown. Meanwhile, a Hunter's Flayed Shot ability has only a 30-second cooldown. Moving on to Nadija The Mistblade, the top of her tree is directly related to Door of Shadows, the Venthyr signature ability which has a 35-yard range and a 1-minute cooldown. Now, you can choose either Agent of Chaos, which causes a disorient at your landing spot, or Fancy Footwork, which gives you a temporary speed boost. And before you ask, yeah, Door of Shadows will break stealth as soon as you start casting. Further down the tree are a few interesting choices. Exacting Preparation makes your food, your flask, and your weapon enchants 15% more effective, while Dauntless Duelist makes your first target take more damage and deal less damage to you, which seems plenty more effective of a choice in longer encounters. At the bottom of the tree is Thrill Seeker, which encourages a constant rhythm of combat. This buff seems to activate every 80 seconds, or faster as long as you're killing things, making the bottom of this tree ideal for dungeons or very high ad encounters. Only 2 of the Venthyr trees were available on Icy Veins, so let's move on to the Night Fae. At the top of the Dreamweaver's tree is Field of Blossoms, which buffs Soul Shape, the Night Fae signature ability with a 1.5-minute cooldown. When Soul Shape ends, or maybe when you right-click and disable the buff, you give nearby allies a haste buff for 15 seconds. Further down are a few choices. Social Butterfly is a semi-passive versatility buff. Soothing Voice extends the effects of stuns and other crowd control effects for a few seconds, while Empowered Chrysalis turns some of your overhealing into a damage bubble. At the bottom of this tree is Pod Tender, a cheat death mechanic that works, at least as long as you don't take an additional 10,000 damage. At the top of Korayn's tree is either Horn of the Wild Hunt or the more interesting Wild Hunt Charge. This particular one turns your Soul Shape into a charge stun that's usable every 1.5 minutes. Further down there is one node called Face Your Foes that causes enemies that face you to deal slightly less damage, which is, just okay when compared to the other choices on this tier. At the bottom of this tree is Final Moment, which is pretty cool. It starts off as a minor boost to healing on low health targets or a DPS increase during the execute window, but if an ally were to die, this boost is increased to 15% for 30 seconds, despite what the tooltip would make you think. But this is a fairly significant boost that just requires a sacrifice towards the end of an encounter. And finally, we move on to Nia, who again changes the way Soul Shape works. Stay on the Move reduces the cooldown of Soul Shape by 1 second per kill, and Sylvari adds a stealth utility to Soul Shape once it ends. Going down a little bit, we run into a very diverse tier with Nia's tools. Burrs is a trap that slows enemies and deals damage. Poison rewards successful and consecutive interrupts, and Herbs provides a haste buff on targets of helpful abilities. A few tiers down, we run into Care Package, which won't help you top meters necessarily, but this actually rewards your activities with crafting materials, and the more you do while Nia is your soulbind, the more you get. I have a feeling that the amount of materials that you get only amounts to so much, but for the resource-hungry person looking for some passive gains, here we are. At the bottom of this soulbind is Grove Invigoration, which basically gives you a 10% mastery buff. And last but not least, let's move on to the Necrolord Covenant. Starting with Bonesmith Heirmir, at the top of this tree, you can choose Serrated Spalders, a passive Thorns, or Resourceful Fleshcrafting, which reduces the cooldown of Fleshcraft by 1 second per kill. By default, Fleshcraft has a cooldown of 2 minutes. Moving a little bit further down, we get to choose a trait among Heirmir's arsenal. The Merrill Gemstone is arguably my favorite, which gives a whopping 20% crit chance for 10 seconds and has a cooldown of 1 minute. Further down, Smithing Expertise works the same way as Care Package under Nia, except this time you only obtain mining materials. And at the bottom of the tree you get Forge-Born Reveries, which is sort of like a Priest's Spirit of Redemption, only violent, and you can still be killed. It too lasts for 10 seconds, and it doesn't seem to have a cooldown. Under Emeni, at the top of this tree is something I find pretty fascinating, which is Emeni's Magnificent Skin, which stacks every time you use your Covenant ability. When you use Fleshcraft, you consume the stacks to gain health from up to 4 stacks. This one's interesting because some Covenant abilities have cooldowns under 30 seconds, meaning some classes can use Fleshcraft to have a nearly constant increase of 20% HP. Going further down, we can choose from several buffs based on our situation, like increased movement speed, haste, or a fear defense. What you choose here is mostly based on what sort of profile you want this soulbind to be, one that regularly fights numerous enemies, or one where you're constantly at low health, like in Torghast, for example. And at the bottom is Rune-Scribed Bone, which is also dependent on defeating enemies, but this enhances your soulbind traits for 30 seconds, and as far as it looks so far, you can immediately reapply this buff as long as you keep gaining stacks. The last one on this list is Plague Deviser Marileth, and at the top of its tree is Volatile Solvent. It causes you to gain an extra buff depending on the kind of corpse Fleshcraft absorbs, and I find this one to be pretty interesting. I presume that this buff lasts for 2 minutes, or until the Fleshcraft's shield is consumed, whichever comes first. Moving down a few tiers, we run into some interesting but pretty low impact traits like Ooze's Frictionless Coating, a damage shield that activates at half health and doesn't appear to have a cooldown, but I'm sure that there probably will be. Meanwhile, Plague's Preemptive Strike provides a small damage bonus for 5 seconds after your first strike on an enemy. And at the very bottom of the tree is Ultimate Form, which makes you immune to crowd control while Fleshcraft is active, which makes for a very convenient way to start a fight in PvP arenas, for example, and could maybe even break some dungeon or raid mechanics. I didn't talk about every single known soulbound trait, so again, I invite you to take a look at the article below if you're interested in seeing all of them. But after reading through this thing a few times, I have a few takeaways. One is a given that, hey, this is the alpha, and who knows what's going to happen when this feature is finally available for testing. From looking at this, soulbinds are a highly customizable collection of traits and enhancements that you can swap in and out. If you think of the punch card trinket from Mechagon, it's sort of like that, but it's magnitudes more in depth. Soulbinds are going to be approached in one of two ways. One, I would argue, is to just reject the personalization of it and just, do whatever the Sims tell you. The other approach is going to be a total free-for-all, a sort of expression of each character's playstyle. When I look at the Kyrian Soulbinds from the eyes of a Protection Paladin, I can see myself with 3 different tanking profiles between outdoor questing or raiding or Torghast, but maybe one of the Soulbinds worked pretty damn well for healing in PvP, or I can change things around to make it work for me. I think it's going to be really interesting and maybe a little bit depressing as we see conversations that pit roleplay versus optimization as if they can't be the same thing. That's going to happen once we get more of this content in our hands to test, and hopefully we'll get them soon. Otherwise, as I've said before, the lack of transparency with Soulbinds so far threatens to be a repeat of Blizzard's mistakes, not giving us a chance to give feedback soon enough, and the clock is ticking.